Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I'm Alyssa, and I'm honored to host this important discussion on behalf of Refugee Outreach Collective. So today we have four distinguished speakers who will shed light on the various dimensions of the medical challenges faced by the Palestinians. Our speakers will discuss the health infrastructure of Gaza, the medical consequences of the attacks, and including the physical and mental health repercussions on the Palestinians. So today, our first speaker is Dr. Rezan Nasiri. He's a current professor of pharmacology and toxicology at MSU's College of Osteopathic Medicine. Dr. Nasiri has academic expertise in infectious diseases, tropical medicine, and global health. He has served as an associate dean of the Global Health and the director of the Institute of International Health at MSU-Com. He is internationally recognized for his work and is known for his effective international partnerships. He has also served as a consultant for the WHO. Our second speaker today is Dr. Alice Rothschild. She is a physician, prolific author, and filmmaker who is focused on human rights and social justice of the Israel and Palestinian conflict since 1997. Dr. Rothschild is a retired assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology from Harvard Medical School. She is on the board of Gaza Mental Health Foundation and is on the steering committee for the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council. Our third speaker today, I'll introduce her, but she's not here right now, is Dr. Farha Abbasi. She is the assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at MSU and a core faculty member of the Muslim Studies program. She's the founder of the annual and the global Muslim mental health conferences, is the managing editor for the Journal of Muslim Mental Health. Dr. Abbasi chairs the Mental Health Task Force for the Mayor of Lansing and has been distinguished through multiple awards for community service and promoting mental health. Our last panelist today is Dr. Salah Hassan, who will be running the Q&A session. Dr. Hassan is an author and a documentary producer. Currently, he is the Director of Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities program at MSU, an associate professor in the Department of English, and a core faculty member in the Muslim Studies program. So I want to thank you all for being with us here today and for presenting on such important issues during a critical time. At this point, I would also like to mention the Q&A feature for the attendees. Please submit your questions during the webinar, and Dr. Hassan will address the most common questions asked at the end of the presentations. Answers to the questions asked in the webinar will also be featured on a resource guide disseminated after the event. If you're interested in receiving this, please type in your email in the Q&A chat. If you're interested in being sent the document, your email will not be shared to anyone, only the panelists can see it. So now, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Nasiri. He will be presenting on and discussing the health infrastructure of Gaza and its recent decline.
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Thank you. Alisa, thank you so much. This was actually quite timely. And I should say the flow of information is so rapid that honestly, on daily basis, I cannot keep up with the flow of information, although I have two WHO colleagues and also one colleague from Norway. I always check with them when I receive information because validation of information is very important, for me. So I am hoping in 15 minutes, I will accomplish the following. Some of the important timelines, although I cannot include all timelines concerning, how the collapse of Gaza infrastructure occurred, But if you were to ask me what is the fundamental for my webinar tonight, this is the Global Health 101. This is quite fundamental what I'm trying, to convey. to the audience, then the field testimonies and the reports, followed by call of action, and summary. So there are so many timelines, but October 15th was quite devastating. And this was like the ambulances were carrying, the bodies, and including, dead bodies, and by October 15th, the death toll was 11,000, and now it has increased probably more than 13,000, of which there's an estimation that around 5,000 are children. And then October 17 was more devastating because there were more raids, air raids on Gaza hospitals, to the point, the Gaza was declared as a public health crisis. You can see here, there is a air raid, on Al Ahli Arab Hospital. I just wanted to bring other hospitals because the focus these days is Al Shifa Hospital, but I can personally address it at the Q&A question if you have any question for me for Al Shifa Hospital, and I'm pretty much sure that Dr. Rothschild will cover it as well. So you can see the devastation here. People are sleeping on the streets. Ambulances were air raided. Here I think these are two sisters looking for shelter, and this is the consequence of air raid in Al Ahli Arab Hospital. At that particular day, November 17, there was 15 death toll. But what struck the most the scientific and public health and health community was this paper, which was published in the Journal of Lancet in October 18. And clearly, the author indicated there was no water, no electricity, and few surgical instruments, and even no anesthetic agents. And then at the end, the author said that our healthcare system has already collapsed, and the UN has sent so many urgent messages to different stakeholders in the world, including the United States. So then November 19 was again quite devastating in the public health infrastructure, and there was more air raid. You can see here, he's a physician, okay? And he's just desperate, and he can't do anything. And here are some photos of the children afflicted by the air raid, and we know that, from this period on, there was even a scarcity of IV fluid and even, oxygen in Gaza. So you can see from this picture, this is the scrub. I mean, we are so lucky here in the United States, our scrubs are quite clean. So this doctor, is wearing a scrub, which is really substandard and contaminated, with blood. So this is the situation where the Gazans were really facing, But more devastating news came from the World Health Organization, okay, and which declared a public health catastrophe. What you see here is a UN-run school, okay? And because of continuous air raid, the citizens had no choice but to go to such schools. You can imagine thousands of people flooded in this school. There is no shower, by the way, in this school, and the toilets were quite limited. So I call this the most public health catastrophe that I've ever come across. I was telling Alisa a few minutes ago, I covered public health consequences in Yemen conflict and in Syrian conflict and also in Sudan conflict. I've never seen such a devastation in my whole life, and I've been in global health for almost 40 years. And then on November 1st, there was significant air raid, and including Al Shifa Hospital. And this is where than the World Health Organization. Along with the United Nations, they really declared a public health emergency. And what you see here, these are the premature babies from Al Shifa Hospital. My WHO colleagues, told me few of them just passed away, and because there was no electricity, so they were pulled out from the incubators. And I understand that as of this morning, there's an effort to take some of them, to transport some of them to Egypt. And then the next day, November 2nd, WHO again warns an imminent health catastrophe in Gaza. And many hospitals, they ran out of supply of oxygen and medical supplies. In addition, by November 2nd, many ambulances, they were out of service because they were all, air raided, and especially the convoy of ambulances. And many patients, as a matter of fact, they lost their lives, while, being carried by these ambulances. So this is the highlight of, my presentation tonight. I call it Global Health 101. I have an online course on global health, and as this is my expertise, and this is a classical textbook that every global health expert should be aware of it. We even teach it to our students in global health, majors, And what are those basic principles? Well, the basic principles, I want you to think of a building as a pillar, okay? So these basic principles, they serve as a pillar. So if the pillar is shaky and the pillar is attacked, certainly the building will collapse. This is how it happened, So what are the elements of these 101 health, public health? Well, public health supplies, okay? And the supplies could be, the goods, such as medications, but also essential medications. I don't need to talk about it right now, but at the Q&A, I can address it, because that's a WHO list. But more importantly, and also in line with the Geneva Convention, is the supply of fuel to all hospital and healthcare centers. And this is also a provision of Geneva Convention. And then the other elements are functional healthcare facilities. And I repeat, functional healthcare facilities. And of course, services. These are, usually done, by professionals, and the members of community may have non-communicable diseases, chronic conditions, particularly diabetes and hypertension, and so on. So on the next slide, which is the last slide on Global Health 101, is the delivery and access, and that entails the availability of information, where the patient should go, and availability of, again, the services, and also essential medications and how they are distributed, as well as accessibility. And that is the geographical, and physical facility, which, by the way, there is almost none in Gaza, And of course, quality, that's the competency that is not only shared by public health, but also in clinical practice, So let's just shift to the testimony and reports. This is Antonio Gutierrez, okay? And in an interview with the Deutsche Welle, that's a German, news agency, he warned the world about, even though he's not a medical person, and the WHO is under the auspice of the UN, he warned an inevitable spread of typhoid and cholera. He talked about dehydration and diarrhea, in children. But most importantly, perhaps some of us, we don't know that there are more than 100 WHO and UN staff members. They lost their lives as a result of bombing raids, And he reported there are decomposing bodies all over Gaza. And also he quoted our IRC that, there is an imminent infectious disease outbreak in Gaza. And you can see here on this slide, this is stagnant and contaminated water. Any public health expert can attest that in such an environment, there's always, a spread of, diseases, especially, waterborne diseases and mosquito-borne disease, to the point that there was actually a report from CNN and Gaza forced to drink dirty and salty water. Some Gazan civilians, they resorted to drink, water from the sea, and they were not aware of the consequence of drinking, salt water. And now we have all over Gaza, I repeat, all over Gaza, trashes, the pile of trashes are accumulating, and there is no services to remove these, trash. And you can tell that, they are the source of bacterial and other, infections in the community. This gentleman is Stefan Yerik, and he's a spokesperson for the United States. What really astonished me during his, interview and his briefing, he has daily briefing, on Gaza. There is only one toilet for 600 people. One toilet for 600 people. In addition, he warned about the risk of, disease outbreaks. And even UNICEF, staff were killed during bombing. However, we don't know how many of them. I always check with my WHO colleague. They don't have precise statistics. Then we come to a point where the Guardian reported possibility of starvation. Here you can see here, this is actually a local bakery, and people are trying to get just a loaf of bread, and many of them, they stayed in the queue for almost 10 hours. Not even a single loaf of bread, was available. Keep in mind, most bakeries in Gaza, now they're using contaminated water for making their dough. And this gentleman is the Director General of the WHO, and he reported that almost 1.5 million displaced Gazan, and you can see nearly half of them, they live in facilities, we call it, UNRWA. That's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. And he reported, that basically they have supply of, medications, but most importantly, supply of food. And he also reported starvation in Gaza. And the United Nations itself, you can see this is the assembly in the honor of, people lost their lives on both sides. They declared 1 minute of silence, but it didn't take a minute for the spokesperson for the United Nations to declare that nowhere and no one is safe in Gaza, and that is through the WHO, chief. Now, with respect to fuel, now there is almost, a total shutdown of desalination plants, and there is no drinking water. And if there is the source of water is, contaminated, but also disruption of the fuel has caused, that there is no services, to take care of, waste collection all over Gaza. What is striking the most is this interview. I don't know whether you have seen this interview or not. This was an American nurse, working in Gaza. The interview appeared in the CNN, and she reported children with massive burn down their face and neck and limbs. And she reported in a camp with 50,000 people, there was only 4 toilets, partial amputations. And I know through my colleagues from WHO and one colleague from Norway, these amputees, they had to leave hospitals, okay? And now they're out, in nowhere, and there's a threat of infections, for their body. And of course, she reported horrible stories. I just highlighted some of them. For example, for a couple of weeks, she had to live on 700 calories per day, finally through Rafah crossing, she exited, Gaza. So in a summary, what I have presented to you based on principles of Global Health 101, the essential principles, based on evidence that I collected, based on the interviews and based on reportings, the current public health status of Gaza does not meet standards and basic principles of global health. And that is primarily due to continuous bombing rates, shelling, and also ground assaults, which collectively caused the collapse of the public health crisis in Gaza. But there is also a dire need, repeat, dire need to restore Gaza's public health infrastructure. So this whole story reminded me of my countryman, Sadi. He's a Persian poet, educator, philosopher. Actually, his poem is in the entry of not only United Nations, I've seen it myself, but those days I used to collaborate with WHO when I used to go to Switzerland. I used to also see it in Switzerland, So I don't want to go through all the, poem, but the last thing really struck me the most, and let me repeat it in Persian, then I'll translate, تو که از مهنت دیگران بیغمی نشاید که نامت نهند آدمی. If the misery of others leaves you indifferent, with no feelings of sorrow, then you cannot be called human being. So in the spirit of Sadi, the Persian poet, this is what should be the call for action. The WHO and also Médecins Sans Frontières, these are the French, group. I worked with them for many years when I was the Dean of Global Health, okay? They must be allowed to collectively rebuild the public health infrastructure in Gaza. There should be consensus, international consensus, that the International Red Cross and also Red Crescent, all right, to jointly work and reach out to different Gazan, communities. But most importantly, and this is my own view, that there should be field hospitals. And the reason I say field hospitals, currently none of the hospitals in Gaza, more than 20, their infrastructure really doesn't exist, So they're not safe. I have not even talked about environmental aspect of air raid, chemical aspect of air raids, the short-term effect, the long-term effect, So it is almost impossible to go right now and rebuild, these hospitals. Therefore, the best solution for now is field hospitals and also explanatory, clinics. I think this is where to start until, the fundings and hopefully ceasefires after that fundings come. And then, we should go and look at the hospitals, evaluate the hospitals, and see how we can restore, public health sector as well as the care sector. So I will stop here, and I'm sure there will be questions, and I will address it, at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nassiri. Yes, we will be answering questions at the end, but our next speaker will be Dr. Rothschild, and she'll be delving deeper into the medical consequences from the attacks.
Okay, let me just bring up my screen. Okay. So we're looking at, so now I have too many things on my screen. Okay. We're looking at the health consequences here on day 43. And I just want to start out with a quote from Avi Dichter, who is Israel's Ministry for Agriculture and the former head of the Shin Bet. And what he said was, we are now actually rolling out the Gaza Nakba. So we are at a place where 1 in 57 Gazans have been killed or injured. Now, just for a little background, I've been to Gaza 4 times. The last time was in August of this year with different NGOs. So I don't have the kind of experience our previous speaker had in international work, but I have been there. And I've been always invited by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. And over the years, I've done direct services, women's empowerment groups, and a lot of bearing witness and documentation. I'm also involved with several groups that are active in working with people in Gaza. So I just want to start out with sort of the take-home message of where we're started from, because to understand the current situation, you have to understand what was going on the day before the attack. And I'm just going to read this because it summarizes everything. More than 75 years of Israeli domination and dispossession has affected Palestinian life through occupation, siege, annexation, de-development, and permanent displacement of refugees, severely impacting the ability of Palestinians to access the essential building blocks of health. The fragmentation of society and destruction of the ability and opportunity to create essential institutions involved in healthcare has created a reality that is recognized as medical apartheid. 2 separate systems, 2 separate realities. And we see this quite clearly in the differences in life expectancy, 73.9 for Palestinians in the territories, 82.5 years for Israelis, and also in infant mortality. I'm sure it's worse now, but 17.9 per 1,000 live births in the territories and 2.9 in Israel. And this has been accomplished through a very systematic de-development of the healthcare system, of the Israeli government not allowing the healthcare system to grow and people to be educated and to acquire new equipment, et cetera, et cetera. It is also true that there is a strict medical permitting system so that patients in Gaza who need high-level care have to get a permit from the Israeli authorities. There's a chronic, decades-long lack of medications and equipment, a history of multiple direct attacks, the current one is the absolute worst, and a high level of conflict-related trauma. So as was mentioned before, we need to remember the Geneva Conventions. And as I speak about what's going on, I want you to be thinking about that this is the rules that we're supposed to be following. And basically, the Geneva Convention says that an occupying power should not interfere with the delivery of healthcare for humanitarian functions. So if we look at healthcare in Gaza, this is before. The Lancet described it as fragmented and incoherent. We have more than 2.3 million people. The Ministry of Health was established in 1994 post-Oslo. You heard about UNRWA, which was established around 1950 for the care of refugees. And there are approximately 1.5 million Gazans living in 8 overcrowded refugee camps. Then we have a host of non-governmental organizations, such as Palestine Medical Relief Society. We have private providers. And then we have the role of the Israeli government in de-development. Now, pre-attack, there were 13 governmental hospitals, 142 primary healthcare centers, mostly Ministry of Health, but also UNRWA. And then the biggest share was in the NGO sector. There were approximately 40 private hospitals, 2 medical schools, and then a bunch of professional schools. There is a tremendous mismatch between the availability of personnel and the ability to hire them and pay them. So I was reported that 120 nursing positions are open each year in Gaza, and yet there are 5,000 nursing students in Gaza. Less than 20 psychiatrists in Gaza exist in Gaza, and less than 7 of them are physicians. So before the attack, several years ago, the UN said that Gaza would not be habitable by 2020, which is 3 years ago. So Gazans were living in a desperate humanitarian catastrophe, under siege. The water was polluted and salinated. Healthcare, nutrition, fuel, electricity, sewage, housing, all were on life supports prior to the attack. There was a tremendous amount of environmental contamination due to all the bombings. There is the climate crisis. Gaza is a coastal plain. Farmers told me about how their grapes just burned on the vine. There was a big hit to the medical system with the COVID-19 pandemic. And during the March of Return, which was a weekly protest that went on for a year, there were enormous, enormous numbers of young people, mostly young men, who were shot at and had severe orthopedic injuries, also stressing the hospital system. In addition to what we've mentioned in terms of electricity and fuel and permitting and shortages, Gaza also has a chronic lack of specialists, exhausted medical personnel who are incredibly dedicated and incredibly tired and often unpaid. As we've mentioned, UNRWA has had a chronic problem with funding. It was slashed by Trump. It was partially restored by Biden. But before the current assault, UNRWA was reporting that they might have to cease operations due to the budget crisis and donor fatigue. Now, the Israeli siege not only restricts everything that goes in and goes out, they have other policies that are really detrimental to Gazans. There is a repeated activity of fumigating the farmlands with herbicides along the eastern perimeter fence, poisoning the soil and destroying crops. The Israeli military has decimated the fishing industry, and Gaza is a fishing area. This was one of their main sources of food. And the Israeli military has severely limited the fishing zones and fires at fisherfolk, destroys their boats and makes them their livelihood impossible. The Israeli military has also intentionally flooded the farmlands along the perimeter fence right before harvesting, thus again destroying food sources. Now, when I was there in August, there were about 18,000 Palestinians from Gaza working in Israel, and they did not have medical insurance. They were in high-stress jobs like agriculture and construction, and when they got injured, these employers would not pay for their medical care, and they were basically returned to Gaza where there was not adequate medical care. And indeed, the workers who were stuck in Israel once the attack started were treated horribly. They were arrested, they were detained, they were beaten. It's just a horrific story about what happened to those workers. In August, the UN Right to Health program said that the number of permits to leave Gaza was 88% below the monthly average in 2000. Mostly these were the economic workers, and only 6% of the exits were for patients, for medical treatment. And 19% of them were not improved on time. So you get the most sick people who have to go through the rigmarole of applying and then miss their appointments because the approval did not come through on time. Now, when we look at what's happening, as mentioned, there is a total disintegration of the healthcare system, with over 12,000 people injured, 68% women and children, enormous numbers of people, that's killed, enormous numbers of people injured, thousands under the rubble, including many, many children. The providers and colleagues that I know talk about how there is the smell of death everywhere with the rotting corpses. The West Bank has also exploded with 215 killed, approximately 50 children, almost 3,000 injured. And in Israel, 1,200 people were killed and almost 5,000 injured. And there have currently been 53 soldiers killed in Gaza, with 240 hostages. What the Israelis have done is a relentless carpet bombing of Gaza, hitting civilian structures, hospitals, clinics, ambulances. There's a full electricity blackout, a total lack of fuel, a total lack of water and food. And the lack of fuel is not only for the ambulances to run, but the fuel is used for the generators to generate electricity. Almost half the housing units have been destroyed or damaged. There are about 1.6 million people internally displaced, many sheltering in UNRWA facilities. We mentioned water, food, and medicine shortages. This has obviously produced increased intracommunal tensions and gender-based violence. And there are about 5,500 women that need to deliver each month. And it's important to remember that these women have had no prenatal care. They have a situation of malnutrition, toxic water, and then they have no idea where they're going to deliver. And there are reports of women having C-sections without anesthesia, and there's a lack of antibiotics, so the infections are problematic. The people who fled from the north to the south, who were told to do this, report being shot at, arriving with shots in their legs. Many have been arrested, beaten, stripped. There's a big checkpoint that is pretty horrific. And it just reminds us that there are no safe places in Gaza. And the Israeli military has now announced they're going to start bombing the south, although they already have been bombing the south. So if you think about what's going on in hospitals, anyone who relies on electricity is at risk for dying. That's the NICU, that's the ICU, that's people on kidney dialysis, that's cancer patients. And there have been multiple Israeli attacks on healthcare personnel. It's probably over 200 by now. 2/3 of the hospitals and many health centers are destroyed or unable to function. Ambulances have been bombed, and there's a critical shortage of drugs, blood products, and supplies. There have been zero medical permits to the West Bank and Israel for care. The providers are also reporting major amounts of unusual burns on the dead and wounded, raising the specter that the Israelis are using white phosphorus, which is illegal. The Rafah crossing, which is the crossing with Egypt, there have just been a little over 1,000 trucks carrying food, water, and medical supplies. Prior to the attacks, there were 500 trucks a day. And there's been a teeny bit of fuel just recently for WHO and for UNRWA. The Israelis are not allowing any fuel other than that small, like for 2 days worth of fuel. The stocks for essential foods are zero. And as I said, no fishing is allowed. And the hospitals in the north have been under severe attack. They were over capacity and also sheltering tens of thousands of internally displaced people. Prior to their attacks, there have been some evacuations as directed by Israel. Now, we've mentioned the attacks on facilities. So the groundwater production is less than 5% of its pre-hostility levels. The sewage and wastewater treatment plants are no longer working. So there's raw sewage being dumped into the sea. And also people are seeing raw sewage in the streets. And as was mentioned, there's an outbreak of infectious diseases, chickenpox, scabies, respiratory illnesses, diarrhea, and people are worried about cholera. And over half of the educational facilities have been destroyed. We do know that education is an incredibly important part of Gazan life and highly valued, and many of these facilities are where IDPs are sheltering. UNRWA has reported, as mentioned, over 100 staff killed, and every day I get a message that this is the last day we can function without any fuel, so it's going to happen any day now. We've heard about the unidentified bodies and the rotting corpses. At Shifa Hospital, they actually had a mass grave, and there was also a mass grave in Rafah because they couldn't take care of the bodies. Palestinian armed groups continue their indiscriminate rocket fire into Israel. It is estimated that the Israeli bombardment is equivalent to 2 atomic bombs. Gaza is 6 miles by 26 miles in size. So we have massive amounts of civilian injury and death. We have what appears to be clearly a genocide and multiple war crimes. I want to focus on Al-Shifa Hospital. This was the main hospital in Gaza, a 700-bed hospital that served the needs of about 500,000 people. On a huge complex of 45,000 square meters, it employed 1,500 medical staff. So this was a major institution in Gaza. Before November 15th, it had been bombed several times, either directly or just adjacent to it. And so the surgeries departments, the coronary care division, a warehouse, and the maternity and outpatient centers had been hit. On the 15th, Israeli troops and tanks entered the hospital. They took control of several sections, searched and interrogated people. Nephrology and internal medicine departments were the first to be stormed. They also detonated a medicine storehouse. Israeli troops ordered all young men on the hospital grounds to surrender. They took captive dozens of displaced people, relatives of patients that are inside, and injured people. And it is reported that many Palestinian men were interrogated, some while being held naked and blindfolded, some taken away to unknown locations. The Israeli military is accusing Hamas of placing a, quote, command center below Al-Shifa Hospital. Hamas and hospital officials deny the claim, and it appears that the evidence for this has been pretty shaky. The New York Times, we've seen this picture before because it is just so horrific. The New York Times reports that Israeli soldiers found about a dozen guns, a grenade, protective vests, and a military uniform within the MRI unit. If you think about it, you wouldn't want to put metal objects in an MRI unit. The New York Times was unable to assess that claim of the command center and unable to assess whether those were actually found there or they were put there by the Israeli Defense Force. When the Israeli defense military invaded, there were no reports of clashes with Hamas on the site, and the New York Times reported that it appeared more like a violent police raid than a pitched battle. These numbers are probably behind, but 20 of the 23 ICU patients had died. 17 others died because of lack of oxygen and water, and several of the premature babies had already died. There were about 7,000 people sheltering in Al-Shifa. A doctor told Al Jazeera that at 9 a.m. they received the order from the Israelis to leave in 1 hour, which was impossible to evacuate everyone. There were no available ambulances, no fuel to drive the ambulances, or other sources of transportation. This situation caused a great state of panic and fear. Many people left on foot. So if you couldn't, and these are hospitalized people as well as internally displaced people. So imagine people who are in wheelchairs, who are being pushed on gurneys, who are limping along with crutches. I mean, it was just a horrific situation. And the people who couldn't leave were left behind with a handful of staff. And one person said, the situation is really dire. The facility was largely deserted. So when we put all of this together, I think one of my messages is that the Hamas war crime does not justify a Gazan genocide. We see a picture of intense racism and revenge with little regard for civilian lives. We see multiple violations of international law, collective punishment of an entire civilian population, multi-generational trauma layering on years of previous trauma, obvious ethnic cleansing, actions that now most experts agree qualifies as a genocide. And what is clear is that the health of Palestinians is intrinsically linked to their liberation and to the end of the siege. But first, what we all must be working for and crying for and protesting for is a ceasefire. And then, as was mentioned, massive humanitarian aid, release of the hostages. And then in the long run, there has to be people and institutions and internationals addressing the root causes of Palestinian oppression and holding Israel and the US accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rothschild, for sharing. Our next speaker will be Dr. Abbasi.
So, thank you so much to both my esteemed colleagues and to everyone attending. So I think as a mental health provider, the struggle becomes in times of conflict when you are in a crisis mode. I think biggest casualty becomes the mental health. Nobody is really thinking of mental health because it's taken as a luxury. Like right now, I have to survive. So really, right now, what is happening at a colossal level, the trauma, the mental, physical, emotional scars that are being, that we are seeing are happening on the not only people living in Gaza right now, but people who are vicariously engaged or involved or invested. So we all are, it's like just sitting through this presentation, we all could feel the impact that it's having on all of us here. So I think right now I would like to talk about that even before this conflict, we were on a breakdown of mental health crisis in Gaza and West Bank both. And this is what I'm just going to give you some numbers, and then we can talk about the impact of the trauma. So by rough estimate, 58% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip suffered from symptoms of depression. This is before the conflict. So the what we saw was that depression, PTSD, anxiety was prevalent on both sides. But Gaza already was like almost the numbers were double than of what was available on the West Bank side. So 58% were reporting depression. So it came to a point that those of us who were working with Gaza mental health, or the psychiatrists were global psychiatrists working with Gaza mental health, then came up with they said that you can't call it post-traumatic stress disorder, because post-traumatic stress means that the trauma has ended and that you are now in a phase of or hoping to recover or heal. But what we are seeing in Palestine is persistent stress disorder. They don't get any relief. It's like one incident after the other. So by a rough estimate, a Palestinian child can face 3 to 4 traumatic events in their life in form of conflict, socioeconomic deprivation, not having access to healthcare, nutritional deficiencies, but the traumatic incidences are really high. So the numbers were showing that 80% of children were reporting perpetual state of fear, worry, sadness, and grief. 3/4 of children were bedwetting in fear, and a growing number were exhibiting reactive mutism. And this, I've seen so many pictures. You must have seen it too. And I didn't have the heart to share any of those pictures right now. Because I think when we are watching this, we need to be aware, we need to watch this, but it also then, I fear that we get to a point of numbing and our own trauma overwhelms us to the point that we might not be able to function and do. And right now, I think it is so important for all of us to sustain and continue to work for people who are still there in that situation. So I did not share any pictures, but this is, if you do look at those pictures now, you would see this reactive mutism, especially if a child has seen a parent die or has been near where the bombing happened. So one of our colleagues when visited Gaza Strip and said that the 50% parents were literally begging for a treatment because they didn't know what to do when their children wake up in middle of the night screaming and crying and putting hands over their ears, even if there was no noise happening at that moment. So you can imagine these kids feel there's constant bombing happening around them, and they are waking up with this. But this reactive mutism, another thing, even before all this happened, there was only one psychiatric hospital working in Gaza, and there were maybe 2. So there were 3 trained psychiatrists, but then one sadly died in one of the conflicts. So there were 2. So most of this psych hospital is being run by physicians or technicians who are not trained in psychiatry and who do not have access to the training to get to psychiatric education. So this hospital only had the ability to deal with severe cases. And what are the severe cases? Where they stopped functioning. So imagine a life that you are persistently living with this trauma. You continue to function. And if in any case it's impacting you to a point that you are paralyzed, then only you could be taken to this hospital. And right now, I don't know because the numbers coming out, again, I said that in moments when the conflict is happening, it is really hard to gauge that if that hospital, what level that psych hospital is working at right now, or even if it's functional right now. So another piece that we were concerned that there was lack of medication. There was maybe 1 or 2 antidepressants available, and there was just one antipsychotic that was available. So really, I just even fear to imagine what the situation is right now. First of all, unfortunately, nobody must be thinking in terms of in face of such massive death and casualties, where Secretary General, UN Secretary General is calling it a graveyard for children. The last we know, 400 plus children are dying every day. So I can't even imagine that who is even has the there is no pause button. So usually what happens is that you can get refuge. You can run to a refuge or safety or hit a pause button. But this is like, there's no refuge. There is no respite for your trauma. So how does your brain continue to function or make sense of what is happening around you? So this is the situation. So the situation was already dire even before the conflict started, to the point that 91% of children were being diagnosed with PTSD. And I'm sorry, this gets too overwhelming for me to even go through. So right now, when we know the numbers are showing that civilian infrastructures that have been destroyed include at least 253 educational facilities, 100 health facilities, 58 places of worship, 3 refugee camps, and more than 40,000 housing units. So rubble, destruction, and there was a question, what does that do to your physical health when you are inhaling these fumes from debris, from destruction? And if there are white phosphorus bomb being used, then what impact is that having on your brain? So those are the things to even think about. So if I look at from the trauma-informed care lens, then also what we are seeing is that the human resilience and human wellness depends on predictability. When I have a structure to my life, when I can predict what I'm going to do, what's next for me, or when I have trust in the system around me, when I have agency, that I make decisions about myself, like I want to eat now, I want to sleep now, I want to take care of this thing. Imagine people living without agency, without any control, without having any predictability, without having any structure, without having safety, security, or trust into tomorrow. And that is deeply what we call the learned helplessness, the helplessness that they are feeling right now, and then not having the like not even having time to pause and express your grief. When you are kind of seeing so much death and destruction, when do you hit the pause button and say, hey, I'm sad? And this is what disenfranchised grief is, that you don't even have the time to grieve or cry, but you are crying, you're screaming, but you are at the same time feeling empathy, distress, you're feeling numb. And like previously mentioned, this trauma is not just for this moment. This trauma is intergenerational trauma being carried on, and this trauma and these deep scars are gonna continue to affect many, many generations. For those who died, those who survived, and those who have witnessed it, the trauma is gonna be the defining symptom going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Dr. Abbasi.
I would like to make one more point, which really stands very starkly, that 50%, so this is before the conflict, that 50% or more of the children in Gaza were hurting themselves or trying to kill themselves. So there were either suicide attempts or suicide completion. That was already a big crisis that was unfolding. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I know it is tough to talk about, and I appreciate you coming on to give more information about what's happening. So now we are going to move on to the Q&A session with Dr. Hassan and our other panelists. Please mention in the Q&A if you have a specific question for a specific panelist. Otherwise, we'll start with Dr. Hassan and open it to everyone else or the other panelists. So I
Thank
can,
you. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say thank you. Did you want to say anything else, Alyssa?
Do you want me to read you the questions before, or would you can also see them in the chat? I've also gotten some direct too.
Yeah, okay. Give me a quick second just to kind of make a few quick comments. That was really powerful, all three of you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And I think that the presentations provided a really important perspective, each one of you, on the issues. I think that Dr. Nassiri really gives us an important observation about how the destruction of the infrastructure of Gaza's medical facilities has produced, important impacts beyond the bombing and the killing from direct assault. That a kind of consequence that we neglect in thinking about are the deaths that arise as a result of disease, contaminated water, and things that happen, say, a week or 2 weeks after the bombing, then are carried forth in through the limited resources and accessibility and availability of healthcare, but also just the spread of infectious diseases. And let me just read to you a recent statement by an Israeli official who said, this is Giora Iliad, who is a former, I think he was a former military official, and he says he distinguishes Israel's position on humanitarian aid from the United States position on humanitarian aid. And he says the way to win the war faster and at a lower cost for us, meaning Israel, requires a system collapse in the other side and not the mere killing of more Hamas fighters. The international community warns us of a humanitarian disaster in Gaza and of severe epidemics. We must not shy away from this, as difficult as it may be. After all, severe epidemics in the south of the Gaza Strip will bring victory closer and reduce casualties among IDF soldiers. So this is part of the war. This is absolutely part of the war. It's one of the strategies that Israel is using to cause more death without, being held directly responsible for those deaths that are a result of the public health catastrophe that ensues from the destruction. And I think that Dr. Rothschild, and I'm not sure if we may have met many years ago. I worked for medical aid for Palestine during the first Intifada, and I was in Gaza quite often at that time, and we were helping to train nurses in Gaza. And some of the statistics you see is that actually many in Gaza have some training in medical care. There's a long history, at least 30 years, going back to the first Intifada, of international support for medical care in Gaza. And Dr. Rothschild is part of that team. I know several doctors from Canada and the United States and Britain that have worked in Gaza. And the kind of work they do is noble and admirable and at great risk to themselves and their careers in some cases. And her observations, I think, really showing, that not only is this particular war part of the process of inflicting suffering on the Palestinians, but this goes back, this is part of a history of the way that Gaza has been treated, but also in the West Bank, where medical services are limited in some cases. And even as Israel has some of the best hospitals in the Middle East, access to those hospitals not always available to Palestinians, or rarely available to Palestinians. And so this idea of de-development in the health sector is a crucial area of making life unlivable for Palestinians under occupation. And her very thorough presentation of that, going back before October 2023, and going back for some time, the 2020 observation by the UN that Gaza will not be habitable in 2020, by 2020, and then we see the conditions were very difficult before and now are almost impossible. And of course, we can't neglect mental health. I mean, as much as we might think of it as a privilege, as we just try to imagine the impact on the many children of Gaza and the adults, but especially the children, this will define them for the rest of their lives. I mean, there's no way that they will ever be able to think of their home with any sense of security. Sleeping is going to be very difficult for the rest of their lives. They will be subject to all kinds of anxieties, and the treatment is not always available, even if you're outside of the occupied territories. So you can imagine living under occupation, how hard it is to find adequate mental health care. And I believe in our communities, our Arab, Middle Eastern communities in general, already there's some stigma attached to that. So when you do have parents who recognize the need and can't get the care, it's a double tragedy. So with those kind of summary points, I want to turn to the questions. We have lots of questions, and maybe Alyssa would be, if you want to go ahead and just maybe read out the questions that you have. We have several in the chat, and we have several in the Q&A, and then we have some that have come in. Do you want me to just go ahead and look at the Q&A questions, and then if you have some, or?
Yeah, that's totally fine with me.
Okay, so Sophia asks, what's the goal of warnings if Israel and other world powers aren't going to listen to the WHO, the UN, and the ICC? So I think Dr. Nassiri, if you're still with us, I don't see you on the screen. If you want to.
I think he got kicked out, but he's welcome back on.
Oh, okay. Did you, Dr. Rothschild, did you want to answer that question?
I think the value of the warnings, first of all, is that we have to recognize that the Israeli government has done egregious things for decades with total impunity. And that is something that absolutely has to change. And so from my point of view, the warnings are very important, partially because the world needs to know what's going on. But also, if we're ever going to hold Israel accountable, they have to be accountable to something. So I think the warnings do have an important part to play in this, but it is utterly frustrating that the Israeli military and the Israeli government does all sorts of egregious things. And, the US keeps spending $3.8 billion no matter what, and then offers them more when they ask for more. So this is part of a whole process, I think, and clearly a very frustrating process.
Yeah, it's in a way, the warnings are, it's in conformity with the international standards. So if they don't issue these warnings, then they're not fulfilling at least their mission, right? They have to at least.
As healthcare professionals, we need to push our government, our professional organizations, NGOs, whatever way we're involved in the healthcare system, to hold Israel accountable to international standards. It is part of the international community. It claims to be a modern democracy. I will put that in quotes. So we have to hold it accountable. And also, we're funding the military. So we have a double responsibility as American citizens. And then, as a Jewish person, I feel like I have a triple responsibility, because the state says that it speaks in my name, although it does not, but it does make that claim. So I have to say "not in my name" really loudly, like every 5 minutes.
Thank you for that, and for your comments. An anonymous attendee asks, thank you so much. Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta, a physician who was at Al Shifa, stated the need for international medical aid to hit the ground running as soon as we're able, whether in Gaza or in Egypt. how can we as students, especially medical students, be useful in supporting the long-term health needs of Palestinians going forward? Dr. Rothschild, I'm going to ask you to answer that one.
So I think right now, the role of healthcare professionals is to convince the United States that we must have a ceasefire immediately. There is no future unless there's a ceasefire. So what medical students can do, they can take their medical student organizations, AMSA, whatever, I don't know what other organizations students belong to, and get them to make a position paper defending the idea that a ceasefire is absolutely necessary and humanitarian aid is absolutely necessary. They can organize their communities to contact every elected official they can imagine and do that every day. They can be out protesting, wearing white coats, showing that there is a medical contingent of American citizens who want a ceasefire immediately. And I think that's the current role that would be most effective right now. The long term is so up in the air because the long term depends on the political situation. I mean, we hear all sorts of horrific things from Israeli governmental officials about, throwing all the Gazans into the Sinai and having them live in refugee camps and tents there. We hear maybe the people who fled to the south will never be allowed to go back to the north. We have no idea what is going to be left of the infrastructure and where Gazans are going to be physically located. So obviously there has to be a massive humanitarian response, but we don't know basically how horrific it's going to be. And so that's the big unknown right now in terms of actual planning.
There were two additional attendees who asked about medical students helping in Gaza. If they can't get in there, what can they do in their current position? If people can't get to Gaza now, what's available for a medical student to support?
Excuse me,
Many of our attendees are. Yes,
Can you hear?
yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes, we can, Dr. Nassiri, we do hear you. Do you want to comment on?
About medical students?
Yes.
I don't know how come I don't get my video. That's interesting.
We can hear you.
But you can hear me, that's fine. As far as medical students, I understand the question is if they could go and provide some services in Gaza, right?
What can they do in general? Do you have any recommendations for medical students? They can't get into Gaza now. So what can they do?
It's impossible, and we tried it in the past, sending medical students to Syria, Yemen. It was impossible. But what they can do, from my experience of 40 years in global health, they can certainly be instrumental in getting, the supplies, and basic supplies, basic hygiene stuff, things like that. And then, through humanitarian organizations, and I can help them if they want, to send out to Gaza. That's right now they can do it. But as far as, they being on the ground, it's impossible. It's quite impossible. I would also like to point out that we did not address, how many families of healthcare professionals are killed during these raids. Okay. Yes, like UNICEF, WHO, and other organizations. So we have so many healthcare professionals, physicians, nurses, technical persons. They lost their families, as Dr. Abbasi, mentioned. They are yet, in dire need of help. Because as we all know, if healthcare professionals, they're not in the right mind, and they are depressed, and I showed actually a photo of one physician who was sitting and thinking, reflecting on this war. We cannot really deliver effective healthcare delivery to Gaza citizens. So my suggestion is, let's first go and find out what are the health issues that the healthcare professionals are confronting with. Many of them, they lost, family members. They have mental issue problem. After all, healthcare professionals, they're human being like anybody else. They do need, peace of mind and tranquility and also most importantly security to function, their job and their responsibility. I know there was one question. For some reason, I was cut off. I couldn't log in, so I have to relog. In order to bring restructuring of healthcare system and rebuilding and reconstructing public health, the first item on agenda is security. If we are not able to provide security to Gazan citizens and healthcare professionals, believe it or not, nothing can be done. Then after security, and that's the part of global health, spectrum, is, the planning and the management. Right now, there is no planning, there is no management, okay? So how can we go to the first step? How can we establish the first step? The first step is peace, tranquility, security, and that is no raids and no ground assault. Just leave the Gazans alone, let them have access to Egypt, but also let them have access through Mediterranean Sea. So all the necessary help, there are so many friendly governments, they want to bring, help to Gaza. But right now they cannot because the other party doesn't believe, that the help to Gazans should start, perhaps they think maybe next month or a couple of weeks later. But right now, there is no, as we say in French, espoir. There's no hope that we could establish the peace, tranquility, and also security. So the first condition is really security, to establish security, and that is hands off and do not invade, do not put bombs, and let the international health agencies and other governments, start bringing health to Gazans, communities.
I would also like to.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'll be quick. I would also like to add that that obviously there has to be a big international response. Obviously, Israel has no interest in repairing what it has broken, but we have to be careful not to just have the whole situation be NGOs. For the Gazans to have a viable future, they have to have a Ministry of Health that's functional, that is well-funded, that is not usurped by Israeli occupiers. And having NGOs fill the space creates a totally disorganized non-system. So for instance, when I've seen patients in the West Bank and Gaza that are pregnant, the woman will get, the first visit at UNRWA, and then they'll get an ultrasound with a private doc, and then they'll get testing at a private lab, and then they'll come back to UNRWA, and it's chaotic. And that's not the kind of system that really creates health for people. So we have to look at the root causes and be looking into the long term and sort of supporting the governmental infrastructure to make a real healthcare system, and not just have all these people who mean very well and are very often provide high quality care, but it turns into this big jumble of NGOs, and that's not a viable system in the long term.
Also on the
Dr. Abbasi, please.
Sorry. So just want to make a very important point that one thing is the war going on there, the conflict happening there, but the spillover effect that it's having on all of our lives here. You have colleagues, physicians, medical students, families who belong to that region or who are reeling under the impact. There are people here who don't even know if their relatives there are safe, or they are just receiving calls that so-and-so passed away, so-and-so got killed. So you can imagine the trauma, the anxiety, the fear. A lot of people are living here. So as medical students, I think some work can be done right now here, because what we are seeing is this is also, and I keep talking about it, that we have to fight back on the rhetoric that this is some kind of a holy war where Muslims are against all the Jews. So we are seeing hate crimes go up. This is turning into where the number of Islamophobic events have gone up, anti-Semitic events have gone up. Please understand this is a conflict happening in a region which is deeply impacting, scarring all of us. But I think one important thing that the medical students can do beside advocacy, activism, is take care of each other. Reach out to those who are hurting. And I think that is one important piece we can work on.
Dr. Nassiri, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was going to add, the finances is another factor, and there is a lot of devastation when it comes to healthcare and the rebuilding of hospitals and so on and so forth that we all discussed. The WHO really doesn't have much finances options for Gazans. It's all by NGOs, and most NGOs, honestly, from my perspective, they're reluctant to enter Gaza in a situation where there's always raid and bombing, and their lives is in danger. To my opinion, there should be an effort to contact and to have discussions with the World Bank and see how World Bank can allow funds coming through Gaza, so to buy, supplies, medications, so on and so forth, and plus the friendly government, there are actually Arab governments, the rich Arab governments, I don't want to name them, they should be able in part to finance, the reconstruction of healthcare sector in Gaza. And I'm not sure, honestly, if United Nations can bring about consensus of the finances, how to finance, the post-conflict, Gaza, especially in the healthcare system. I was talking actually last week to a WHO colleague in Geneva, he was telling me, the reconstruction of a healthcare system, it's going to be billions of dollars. He had no precise figure, but he said it's going to be billions of dollars. So that's another issue that first has to be discussed. Who's going to fund, all these reconstruction efforts?
Yeah, just to put some of that in perspective, the U.S. pledged $200 million for humanitarian relief relative to $14 billion it's giving to Israel to provide aid in its moment of crisis. So you can see how disproportionate not only the violence is, but also the support that the U.S. is prepared to give. There's a good number of questions. I just want to give everybody a chance here. So we have about 15 minutes left. We could also go over a little bit, but I do want to be aware of the time. So let me just cluster a couple of these questions together for you, Dr. Abbasi. There's where can we find stats on Gaza's mental health? What are some of the other sources you would recommend that we can share to help humanize Palestinians to the rest of the world? And so stats on mental health, and then given the mental health challenges faced by children in Gaza, are there any psychosocial support programs or interventions that have been implemented to address their needs?
So there's Gaza Mental Health Authority, Gaza Community Mental Health Initiative, and then there was some psychologists working on creating a mental health policy. So as far as getting where you can get facts, I can send some of these organizations information to. I can share or send it to Alyssa to share with you all. But right now, the organization that I was working with was Gaza Mental Health Authority. But under this conflict, we have not been able to reach out and see what exactly they are doing in this moment of crisis. Because like I said before, unfortunately, the thought about even doing anything about mental wellness or looking at depression, anxiety, and trauma comes very, very later on. And when we are talking about lack of resources, no finances, no health infrastructure in a society, in a system which already was banking on one hospital and maybe two psychiatrists, and not that much training available. And like we said, the stigma and not talking about the trauma. I really don't know what right now the situation is, but Dr. Bill Slaughter is one leading authority here who has been working with this Gaza mental health. And I can reach out to him and see what kind of information I can gather for you all.
I also have been in touch with Dr. Yasser Abu Jameh, who's the executive director of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. And I think as of yesterday, what he said was, the Gaza Community Mental Health Program is focused on women, children, and prisoners. And they have incredible program for children. They also have a hotline during times of emergency, and they had this whole emergency plan that they had. And because there is, all of their centers are closed, because there is no electricity, even though patients were given the phone numbers of their therapists, they can't call them because they can't charge their phones, and no one can use the hotline because there's no electricity to call the hotline. He said that at this point, in the previous attacks, the staff have all stayed in touch with each other, and they've all kind of stepped up in various ad hoc kind of ways. He said to me that he has lost contact with all of his staff. So his staff has all had to flee, are living in God knows what kind of shelters or family or whatever. So it's not functioning. And this is the premier mental health facility in Gaza that's that you keep mentioning, is the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. There's also a group in the US that I'm on the board of, which called the Gaza Mental Health Foundation, and we raise funds for the program. I'm a friend of Bill Slaughter's. So if people wanted to donate money, that's an excellent, organization, the Gaza Mental Health Foundation. But at this point, the money is just being gathered. It's not being dispersed because, the banks have all been destroyed. There's no fund, no way to send money, or just that the whole system has collapsed.
And to add to that, there is a group of mental health providers from here who want to start telehealth in the region and are ready to volunteer, give free services. But unfortunately, there's no infrastructure on the other side. So we are still struggling to find ways to be able to provide support.
And, if people aren't safe and they have no food, and, they're in a place where there are dead bodies on the street, there's no amount of antidepressants or talk therapy that's going to do anything. As you said, safety, people have to be safe to be able to address their mental health issues.
Thank you. Those are, I put into the chat a link to Dr. Ayed Al-Sarraj's obituary in the New York Times. He was the founder of the Community Mental Health Center in Gaza, and passed away about a decade ago, but you can read a little bit about his vision of mental health care for Gaza. Remarkable man who had many options, but chose to return to Gaza and build a mental health facility at a time when, in the 80s, when not very many people were thinking about that for Gazans. There's an interesting question here from, let me see, Emily asks, do you know what the long-term effects of inhaling demolished buildings and structures may be? Dr. Abbasi, you alluded to that. I know from 9/11, there's been lots of discussion of the effects of inhaling toxins from the building's collapse. Is there any further general research on this in terms of public health or mental health?
So from mental health point of view, we see higher rates. So your environment plays a big role on your wellness, has a direct impact on your mental health. But we also know inhaling lead or fumes or debris can not only impact like we see higher rates of depression, anxiety, but it can affect your ability to focus, your thought process, your attention, ability to learn new information. All that can get deeply impacted. But I'm also concerned with the white phosphorus, if it is true that if that is being used, then what is the impact of that? We see a lot of people not only are going to have immediate impact and we are seeing death and coma could be one possibilities, but the infrastructure of the brain gets disrupted. You can go on to develop cognitive delays and dementia, Alzheimer-like presentation. So there are always an acute impact, then long-term impact that we are concerned with. But definitely a lot of disruption. And that's why I'm really concerned that not only if you look at the cumulative impact, so first of all, we know that the major Gazan population or even the death tolls is showing that the children get impacted the most. And the children are almost 50% of the population is children. So I'm really concerned is with this chronic, persistent exposure to trauma, the socioeconomic situation, nutritional deficiency, then not having access to any kind of healthcare. It's not only present as depression, anxiety, and long-term sequelae, but the ability to focus attention, learn new information. So you are also setting them up for failure in that way. And then the pain, the trauma, the scarring can impact your ability to have relationships, to have functional, trajectory of mental growth. So we are setting up this generation for failure. We are setting that up for, if we go with adverse childhood experiences survey, a child which scores like 4 to 5 on the trauma scale, their lifespan is shortened by 10 to 15 years. And if I already am saying that an average Gazan child goes through 3 traumatic events, at least exposure to 3 traumatic events, and then we are seeing all this other conflict and pain and everything, all the other challenges coming, they already will have shortened lifespans, even if they survive what is happening right now.
And the other thing is that I don't know what the studies are, but it is my impression that Gazans have a higher cancer load than other populations. And I can only predict that their exposure to buildings crumbling down, as well as all the bombing that's going on, will just add to the cancer load. So that's something, the problem is that there's no money to study this, right? But this is something, the other thing I would be very concerned about.
If I may add, we're already seeing, with respect to that question, the toxic fumes coming from demolished buildings, so on and so forth, we are already seeing difficulty in breathing, especially children are coughing, wheezing, and also children are feeling faint. A faint feeling is one of the factors that, could be result of, toxic fumes, and general weakness. So we're already witnessing that, in Gaza, with respect to previous question, how we can help. I agree with the speakers. There are several ways, Dr. Rothschild has a lot of connections. That's great. One thing I have done in the past for Gaza was through my Egyptian colleagues. I used to take medical students with me to Mansoura Specialty Hospital during summertime for infectious disease training over there. So if Michigan wants to do something, there's certainly critical shortage of antibiotics, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, things like that, hypertensive drug, and cardiac drugs, if we could get it through pharmaceutical companies, through other sources, I'll be happy to talk to my Egyptian colleagues in Mansoura and see, if they can arrange, the transfer of those goods and medications, to Gaza. But as I understand now, in next 2 weeks, the other party is not allowing any NGOs to enter. Even I had a talk today with Switzerland. No NGOs is really allowed to enter Gaza, but that could change in a couple of weeks.
You're muted.
Sorry, I'm going to try and wrap some of these questions together and then let you each have final words so that we're already at 7:30. And this is such an important topic, and I think that we're really fortunate to have your expertise, but time is limited for us all. So these last few questions kind of all wrap around the same type of general issue: is what can be done. If we can't get into Gaza to provide supplies and services, what can be done? What can be done if in our own place of study or work, we feel like we can't speak openly about these issues because we're afraid we'll be attacked? This is for medical students who are concerned about their future, that they'll be doxxed and harassed and intimidated, that the university is not providing an environment where, we're doing this, but, we are all confident and senior in our professions without fears of that sort. But for younger people, what can be done to support them, and what are the channels for them to express their concern? And then another question is like, how can we be sure that our humanitarian aid is going to Gaza when there's a total lack of access? How can we be confident if we're making donations that those donations are going to the Gazan medical supplies that are needed or services that are needed? So it's really kind of a big question of like, where is the hope for us to channel? Now we have this knowledge that you've shared. What can be done?
So I would like to address the safety issue for students, because this is a big issue, and it's not just students, it's, people who finish their training, that if you speak up in a sympathetic way about Gazans or Palestinians, there is a whole propaganda industry that monitors speech on Israel-Palestine, that goes after people, that destroys people's careers. I mean, I worked with a lovely Palestinian American who lost his residency because of something he tweeted when he was 15, when the Israelis were bombing his family. So you have to be realistic that there is a whole pushback industry out there. And so the way that you need to defend yourself is, first of all, be very, very thoughtful about what you put on social media and what you say publicly. Only say thoughtful, defensible things. And when you're feeling outraged, angry, despairing, do not go on Twitter, because those messages will come to haunt you when you apply for some job. And this is just a fact of life. If you're going to do work in this, which I highly hope you will, it's very important to work within a community of like-minded people who support each other, who think seriously about messaging and how to present these questions to the public. If you get into legal trouble, there's a group called Palestine Legal, which is an excellent group that helps people who've been attacked because of their public statements on Palestine. So again, you have to be incredibly thoughtful and careful, but it's still work that needs to be done.
Final thoughts, Dr. Abbasi, in response to any of those questions, or anything else you want to add?
So first of all, I think know that you are not alone in this situation. Like Dr. Rothschild said, that we, even as faculty, are reeling under the impact. I think it is important and it's very hard to do, to separate the politics from being a medical personnel. I feel that I have been speaking up and doing more work because I am talking about the trauma, the mental health aspect of the tragedy that we are facing. So I know it's hard. It's hard. And it also depends how close to the fire are you. Like, of course, we all are feeling the impact, but we don't have family in the direct threat, under direct threat, or we are not hearing about 17 people killed of my distant family. So for me, maybe it's easier to separate what is happening from political aspect to from keeping it purely in the realm of medicine and mental health and the trauma, that I think this is then not about, and that's why I think I keep saying it, that we have to be very active, we have to be advocates, we have to state the facts as they are coming out and continue to create awareness around it, but also wearing our physician hats, putting the health as number one priority. So that's how I have been able to speak up and do my work. And I hope all of you stay safe, but also not only knowing what your rights are, but to keep on reporting, find out what are the numbers to call, what's the police number to call at MSU, who is in charge, which medical school you are in, who is in charge of your safety, who are you gonna call, have those numbers ready, and please have low threshold for reporting. It's important that the university, the administration understand that this how it is affecting you. And there is faculty standing by your side. I am at CHM, and if you have any concern, I serve on the diversity committee. I have direct access to the dean. So please, anything you feel that something is unjust is happening to you or anyone around you, just report and know your rights.
If I may add,
Yes, yes. You'll get the
since,
final word, Dr. Nassiri.
no problem. Thank you. When Alicia approached us, and I think my colleagues, I copied my email to everybody, including you, Dr. Hassan, that I said, our webinar should be an academic approach. Indeed, all of us, we provide an academic approach with regard to current issues and problems, whether it's a healthcare, clinical care, or public health. I particularly avoided names. Because the recording is going on, I didn't want to put any name in either party, and the intention was, really to bring awareness to the attendees, and avoiding any political, hot spots, but I agree with Dr. Rothschild. I have seen two Palestinian colleagues in Cleveland area, and their residency program was in trouble because they tweeted things that they should have not done it. As Dr. Abbasi said, we should keep our cool, we should keep our calm, just focus on what's going on and how we can present these things in a non-political fashion, because we're all academic. Our intention was an academic approach to Gaza healthcare system, which is collapsed already. So I just wanted to add that, as a record, that this webinar was strictly an academic webinar.
Indeed. And with experts who provide us with a unique insight into this challenging situation, where, of course, we're all feeling unsettled by our inability to respond professionally and personally to the tragedy that we see happening before our eyes every day. And so as the medical students that have asked these questions and participate in this this webinar. We're really grateful for your commitments, and we admire your interest and willingness to try and make changes. So let me just underline once again how grateful I am to Alyssa and to the Refugee Collective for organizing this panel, and the support of the Muslim Studies program for its encouragement. I'd like to also mention that for members of the Muslim Studies program, students, if you're not involved and you identify with the Muslim Studies program as a student or a faculty member, we'll be holding a meeting tomorrow at 6 p.m. Led by Dr. Farah Abbasi to address some of these issues and our own personal experiences of how we're coping as we try to come to terms with the difficulties that we face. Thank you once again, Dr. Nasiri, Dr. Abbasi, and Dr. Rothschild. And I'll pass it to Elisa to have the final word.
Yeah, I just want to give a sincere thank you to all of our panelists for sharing on such a critical issue, and to the audience for your engagement, thoughtful questions, and interest. I just wanted to say that, remember, like, the conversation doesn't end here. Let's carry these insights forward, share them with others in open dialogue, and continue to advocate for positive change in this world. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you everyone again, to our panelists, everyone who's attended.
Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you so much
Thank
to
you
each
again.
one of you. Thank you.